I just wondered if y'all ever had that problem before. I think it's water.
Oh, I was looking it up and then I got distracted at work. I Google searched just because. I was gonna say something smart, like
I Google searched it. I just wondered if y'all ever had a problem with it before. Water around in the 60s. Not the car was anyone was fired, but the sensor was. Yeah.
Hello.
didn't say.
So, okay, go ahead, too. Hey, so I was taking stuff and I went to go. Monday or Tuesday. I don't remember why we went by your house.
No, it's just went up.
I was like, it was just for y'all. That was awesome.
That's what I was told
So, I thought I'm glad to see you. Glad to see you. I thought about sitting here. I sent you a text this morning. I was afraid that I might forget an answer.
We were talking about that. Somebody said something. We were talking. And on your
So clarify that.
I think it was, I don't know what it is, but I'm so glad I'm not. I really thought it. So anyway, we're gonna have to do that. But I know that thing.
I don't want to give you an answer.
Yeah, it was crazy. So anyway, I know.
Doing all right. I know. Lift your back. Are you glad to be back? I bet you are.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. So tonight is the wrap up of our conversations about crises at work. Not working. Hello. I got one. It's on.
Hello, battery. There he is. Okay. So tonight is the last night of our series on crises of faith, and so we're going to finish with a real positive one. We're going to talk about Judas tonight. Judas was a very fascinating study. And James walked up to me a couple of weeks ago and said, "We got one left, and it's Judas." I said, "Yeah, I'd like to do that." So, because it's very interesting to me, and so I divided it into 4 parts. We're going to talk about Judas and prophecy. We're going to talk about Judas as an apostle, and then Judas as the betrayer, and finish up with Judas and his crisis of faith. And I'm going to try to stay on task because it is the last one, and we won't have class on Wednesday night again for several weeks. And so for whatever we don't get done, we won't get to do, because we're not going to meet the next 2 Wednesday nights for Christmas and New Year's. And then the next one after that, the first one in January, is family night. And so it's going to be 4 weeks before we have a new series. But so I want, on the Judas and prophecy, there is, to me, a surprising amount of prophecy about Judas. And a couple of them are pretty obscure, and so we're not going to look at those. But the Gospels, the story specifically mentions Jeremiah, and those prophecies about Judas that are in Jeremiah are really, really obscure. They're kind of hard to pick it out. So we're going to not read that one. But the first one is in Psalm 109, verse 8. Psalm 109, verse 8. It says, "May his days be few, may another take his place of leadership." And of course, we'll get to what that's alluding to later on. The next one is Psalm chapter 41, verse 9. Psalm 41, verse 9 says, "Even my close friend, whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." And again, we'll get to that in a little bit. But the one that's, to me, probably the most fascinating and the most detailed is Zechariah chapter 11. Zechariah chapter 11 and verses 12 and 13. "I told them, 'If you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it.' So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, 'Throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me.' So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter." And again, I just want to bring these to our attention, read them, and then go on and kind of keep them in the back of our mind as we go through the rest of this. But the next section I want to read these passages and then ask a few questions and get your input on your conversation about some things about these. But Matthew chapter 10, we're going to read the first 4 verses. I just wrote down verse 4 for Alan. But Matthew chapter 10, starting with verse 1, "He called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. And these are the name of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him." So what was fascinating to me about reading that passage is really the first verse. And he says he gave them power and authority to go out and spread the word, to drive out evil spirits, and to heal every disease and sickness. And then he lists the 12. Did he give that same power and authority to Judas? I think he did, didn't he? Judas was one of the 12. He was one of the apostles. He gave, it doesn't say he gave it to all of them except Judas. So Judas, as an apostle, as one of the 12, was included in this role, I believe. I think that's pretty interesting, right? The next one, John chapter 6. John chapter 6, starting with verse 60. Really, it starts before this, but that's where we're going to start. John chapter 6, starting with verse 60. On hearing it, and it is, Jesus does some teaching about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, and that's what it's talking about here. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe." Here, this is interesting. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, This is why I told you that that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him." From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. "You do not want to leave me too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." Then Jesus replied, "Have I not chosen the 12, yet one of you is a devil." He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. So, there's a couple of things about this that I think are interesting and I want to talk about. But I think it's fascinating when Jesus does this teaching that they call a hard teaching, that some of the disciples start to go away, start to retreat, start to pull away from him. And this is something that I think Jesus kind of routinely does. It's like, I always equate it to when I played football in high school, we would do two-a-days. And the purpose of two-a-days, I always thought, was to get rid of the people who really didn't want to play. And so we would, we'd have a practice at 6 in the morning and again at 6 at night. And it was just, when you're 16 years old and 17 years old, getting up at 6 o'clock was horrible, and it was hot weather and the summer. Anyway, Jesus does things like this pretty routinely. He starts doing teachings that are hard to find out who really wants to be here, who really wants to follow me. So he does this teaching, this hard teaching, and people start to pull away. And the first thing I thought of when I read that was Judas one of them? Was Judas one of the ones who kind of pulled away? Because what I'm looking for and what I'm getting at is, while we're reading this, I want us to be looking for reasons why Judas did what he did. Why did Judas end up making the decision he made? And then it says that Jesus knew from the beginning who was going to betray him. Jesus knew from the beginning which one of them was a devil. That's what the words use. So I think that's interesting, fascinating. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. The next one is John chapter 12. John chapter 12, the first 11 verses. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It is worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of the Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. A couple of questions about that. It says Jesus was the keeper of the money, the keeper of the bag, the keeper of the box, I read in some commentaries or whatever. He kept the money. What would we call him today? Treasurer. What does that say about Judas? What does that say about Judas that he was the treasurer of the 12?
He was trusted.
He was trusted. Right. Interesting, right? He was, I don't think that was something that was done lightly. I think that there was something about Judas that they put. So we have somebody who does a lot of our finances and funds here at church. It's Bill Welch. Okay, he's not here. I thought he'd be here. So why do we give that job to Bill? Why is Bill the one who does that for us? He's got a talent to do it. He does that for a living. He's really good at it. And we, like Michael said, we trust him. We know that he knows what he's doing. So I think there's some things about Judas that him given that job to do says about him. He knew how to handle money. He was trusted. He was intelligent. And so I think that's fascinating. I think that's kind of interesting. Do you think that there was something about that role that spoke to any way about leadership? That Judas had any qualities or any things that pointed to leadership? I don't know. Possibly. I think so. So I think Judas was somebody that the apostles respected. Now it's always fascinating to me because these Gospels were written after all this took place, and it's really interesting to me that every single time, I'm going to back up from that, I'm not sure. It almost always, when they mention Judas's name, they parenthetically put in there who was later to betray him. They can't help but say that. They can't ever say Judas was the treasurer. Judas, who was later to betray him, kept the money back. They do it every time, or almost every time. But I think there's something said about Judas that he was made the treasurer, that he was made the one who kept the money. Now, later, I think it's obvious they didn't know it at the time, but later they realized that he was helping himself to some of the funds. And that's important too. The last one we'll look at in this section, Judas as an apostle, is John chapter 13. John 13, verses 10 through 12. Okay, so Jesus is washing their feet. He's just come to Peter, and Peter says, nope, you're not going to wash my feet. And then he says, if I don't wash your feet, then you have no part of me. Peter says, okay, wash my head, give me a bath. Verse 10, Jesus answered, a person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that is why he said, not every one of you is clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. So we'll stop there and we'll come back later. So, did Jesus wash Judas' feet? I mean, it doesn't specifically say, but he doesn't say he didn't.
Which is an exclusive term.
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't leave any out.
So, what would that have been like for Jesus? to wash Judas' feet? Do you think Jesus had any compunction about not doing that? Do you think Jesus was hesitant to wash Judas' feet? Hey, there you are. We've just been talking about you. Do you think he had any reservations about washing Judas' feet? I know this is speculation. We're going to do a lot of that. So tonight,
He was a sinner. He had a demon. Now it points that out. But tell me, which one of them or which one of us is not a sinner?
yeah,
And Jesus came to seek and save, to cleanse those that were sinners. So the fact that he washed, even knowing that, and I read that section in the book not long ago about the writer of that book. I can't remember his name, but anyhow, he posed the question, and it may be one of yours. If it is, well, let me know, and I won't go into it right here. But the question is, Jesus, knowing all of this ahead of time, why did he choose him to be one of the disciples? Were you going to ask that question later?
sort of, yeah. So we'll wait.
Okay, I'll let it go.
Did Jesus have any hesitation about washing Judas' feet? I think that's probably accurate. I doubt it. Because did Jesus have any hesitation about washing Peter's feet? And he knew what Peter was going to do. Matter of fact, he tells Peter what he's fixing to do. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute too. So, how do you think Judas felt when Jesus was at his feet, pouring water on his feet and washing his feet? How did Judas feel? You're going to keep talking. Awkward. What do you mean?
I mean, here's somebody that you are working against, and they're doing something selfless for you. That would be awkward.
I want to keep that whole thought process in mind for a little bit later, but I think that's to me a little bit a better and more interesting thought than the first one. Did Jesus have any hesitancy? How did Judas feel?
He may not have even. There is no indication, although Jesus knew what was going to down the future was going to bring. Judas may not have.
Oh, I think he did, because we're going to talk a little bit. Because in just a few minutes later, he walks up to him and says, "What you're about to do, go do what you're about to do."
Well, but then it goes through that verse too that says, and at that point, that the devil entered into him.
Yeah.
There's a lot of speculation there.
I think that, well, we'll talk about it. But I just think it's very fascinating how Judas, because I believe, Cliff, that he knew what was fixed, that Judas had already agreed to betray him, had already been paid, and all of that. So
It was not a public offering or something that he knew about where he could sell them at Passover.
yeah, so we'll talk. But I just think that was very awkward. It's a great word, and I think even more than that, I think that's mild to what Judas felt at that moment. I think that's very interesting. We'll talk more about that too. So this is where I really want us to start thinking and pondering for the next little bit. We're going to talk now about Judas as the betrayer. And as we go through this whole series of events that leads up to Judas betraying Jesus, I want us to be looking for clues as to why he did it. Why did he do what he did? Because there's clues. And again, I know one time a brother said that we shouldn't speculate, but we're going to do some speculating tonight because, but I think there are some really good, interesting clues as to why Judas did what he did. So the first one we'll place is in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26. And the interesting thing is, yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Matthew 26, verse 14. Then, and see, this is what I'm talking about, Cliff, because in Matthew 26, verse 14, is before the Lord's Supper. Then one of the 12, who is called, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Yeah. Okay. So, what Judas did he do it on a whim? Not at this point. What do you mean?
Well, at this point, he physically he's taken positive action to make this happen at this point. He goes down and says, "What are you willing to pay if I hand him over to you?" And they count out the money, and he takes it.
Yeah.
They have a contract at this point.
They have a contract. Yeah, it's something that he planned, he had thought about, he was making preparations to do. It was not something that was impromptu. It was not, and this is my interpretation of what we're reading. It was not impromptu. It was not, okay, I'm going to do it. It was not impetuous. It was something that he had thought about and were prepared to do. That's my interpretation of what he did here.
Mark, it wasn't even the power to get where Jesus says, "Somebody's going to betray me," and you said, "Well, maybe it could be me."
Yeah.
It was just he already had it in his mind.
He already had it in his mind. We're going to talk about that a little bit more too. So that's right. Yeah, it was something that he had contemplated. He had pondered. He was thinking about doing, to the point that there is a plan. There is a plot to take care of Jesus. The next verse, Matthew 26, verse 47 through 50. Matthew 26. Verses 47 through 50. I'm trying to get the context here. We'll just start with there. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Jesus replied, "Friend, do what you came for." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. Couple of questions here, a couple of things to talk about. What is the fact that there is a large crowd that comes out with clubs and swords and whatever to arrest? What does that indicate? They're going after Shrek. What does that indicate, though? What does that indicate about the plot and everything? They were expecting They didn't think Jesus was going to go quietly, did they? They were prepared for a fight. That's interesting. What else? What does that indicate?
Walks. People from all walks, instead, they weren't military types because they had their farm implements and so forth.
Yeah. They'd grab whatever they had. I think it was not necessarily just soldiers. It was people, probably, that had come together. To me, it indicates there was some time. I mean, in the old Westerns, they got together a posse to go after somebody. It took some time to get a posse together. So there's evidently some time, there's a time period that's taken place to gather this crowd of people to go arrest Jesus. Again, not spur of the moment thing. also to me indicates that there's some degree of notoriety with going to get Jesus, because they were able to gather people together to go get him. So there was a movement underfoot.
You know, there's several times he just walked off.
Who?
Jesus.
Yeah.
And avoided being stoned or whatever.
Yeah. So it indicates, what do you mean by that? What's your point?
That maybe they thought they needed force because he has evaded capture before.
Okay. All right. So he's gotten away before. I don't know why Westerns are in my mind, but Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, they had a hard time catching him. So, so they're come ready to capture him. It also, to me, indicates that, also, Nancy, when we first started that, I thought what you were trying to say is Jesus is letting himself be captured. That he could have avoided this if he wanted to. He could have gotten away. He had done it before. Yeah, he could have called 12 legions of angels. He says that himself. To me, this whole episode is very emotional, because when Judas walks up to him, he calls him what? Rabbi, which means what? And a teacher. So he calls him his teacher. One time when I was teaching, a long time ago, I taught classes of middle school or whatever, and one day I was in Walmart, and this guy walked up to me and had his friends with me. He said, there's my teacher. And I went, that really touched me, that he called me his teacher to his friends. And so to me, this is a greeting of respect, but also a greeting of respect. And somebody that is my friend, somebody that I respect, somebody that I recognize as an authority figure. And when he walks up to him, that's what he calls him. To me, that's like twisting the knife, He calls him Rabbi. How does Jesus respond to Judas? What does he say to him? Calls him friend. Isn't that interesting? He's walking up to you to betray you, and first thing you call him is friend. And then what does he say? Do what you came to do. I know why you're here. I know what's happening. Let's get it done. Makes me think of the 9/11 thing. What did they say? Time to roll or whatever it was. Yeah. I think that's what Jesus is kind of saying. It's time to roll. We're here to take care of this. We're here to do what's got to be done. And I think this is how Jesus, because just maybe a couple of hours, or maybe not that long before this, Jesus is in Gethsemane, and he's praying, "Take this cup from me." And he left Gethsemane with the resolve and the power to do what needed to be done. And I think that's part of what he's saying by, friend, do what you came to do. Okay. Next one. To me, I really love this section. Luke chapter 22. And I think Luke 22, the passage we're going to look at in Luke 22, shows, tells a lot about what's going on. Luke 22, verses 1 through 6. Now the feast of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. What were the Jew? To me, this whole thing speaks of a lot of fear. And fear primarily on the part of the Jewish leadership. What were they afraid of? What were the Jewish leadership afraid of? Commit. This whole thing is clandestine. It's covert. It's secrecy. And I think the reason why is because they were afraid. What were they afraid of? If I'm right, maybe I'm reading something wrong into it. But what were the Jewish leadership afraid of? Because it says they were afraid of people. What were they afraid of?
But, well, they're afraid of a riot. It is the same thing when they were in the temple and so forth, and the soldiers come back, nobody ever spoke like this man did. And beyond that, too, you see, had the people then rose up and created a scene, then the Roman government becomes involved. It gets pretty deep there.
Yeah.
And also that set of verses was why I said that Judas may not have known, because they were at that point they were offering some kind of way they were let folks know they wanted to get him, and he comes in and said, well, what will you give me to do that?
Yeah.
And they agreed on money.
So they were afraid of the people because Jesus had a following, right? He had people that followed him. He had people that were loyal to him. He had people that were in his camp. And so it says that they were delighted when Judas stepped forward. Why were they delighted? Solved the problem. What was the problem that Judas solved by coming forward?
Taking Jesus.
Taking Jesus in a way that was not least likely to cause a problem, least likely to cause a riot, least likely to cause an issue. That's right. Okay. What did the role of money have to do with all this? Because it mentions several times, and it's even prophesied the exact amount of money that Judas would get to do this task, to do this deed. Is the role of money important in the story? And if it is, why? What does that say? The fact that there was money involved. I'm sorry?
Money is often used to determine value.
So I looked that up because I was curious about that. The amount of money was 30 pieces of silver. And was that a lot of money? Yeah. Yeah, and there was some conversation about, was it money that was 90-something% silver, or was it money that was 75% silver, and all that. But what's fascinating is that, from what I could tell, and again, commentaries, I don't know. The one that I read at said that was the price for a slave that had lost his life accidentally. So John has slaves, and I accidentally hurt or kill one of his slaves. I would owe John 30 pieces of silver for the price of the slave that I had injured or killed. So 30 pieces of silver was the value of a slave. That's interesting, right? Does the fact that Judas want money for doing this, does that say anything about Judas? And the possible motive for why he did this? I don't know. Do you think they would have given more money if he had asked for it? Did he sell out Jesus cheap? I don't know. I just think that's some interesting thing to pay, because I think money, part of it, money has to be part of the issue. If not, then he would have just done it anyway. And then, and Cliff's already mentioned this, the significance of the fact that when no crowd was present was important. Because the one thing the Romans hated was any kind of disorder, was any kind of scene, was any kind of riot, was any kind of disturbance. And for the Jews to do this, they had to have it to be as slick as possible.
I think more important than the amount of money, I think it was that the 30 pieces of silver mentioned in the Old Testament is it's a proof of prophecy.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting too, Alan, the fact that the role of fulfilling prophecy in all of this is so significant. We talked about that in class Sunday, about the things that Jesus said on the cross. A lot of it, what he said, was to fulfill prophecy. And you know, and it's fascinating, and when you start talking about fulfilling prophecy, because Jesus, when he spoke those things, he knew what the prophecies were, and he was intentionally fulfilling them. But Jesus had no control over how much money was given, supposedly.
The other is the other side of the prophecy is foreseeing what's going to happen and just telling about it. And then when it happens, you say, there it is.
There it is. That's right. The last one I want to look at in this whole thing about Judas the betrayer is in John chapter 13. John chapter 13, again, going back to the night that Jesus washed their feet, starting with verse 18. Jesus starts off this section by saying, I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill the scripture. He who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. The Psalm 41 passage we read. I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. I tell you the truth, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me. And whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter mentioned this to his disciples and said, ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I give this piece of bread where I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. What you are about to do, do quickly, Jesus told him. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus had said this to him. So Judas had charged the money. Some thought Jesus was telling him to go to buy what was needed for the feast or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. A lot there, too. Oh, me. So I want to get to the last part of it. So sorry about that. But I don't think any of this is... So the topic that we're talking about is crisis of faith, right? In my opinion, none of this necessarily is Judas' crisis of faith. I think Judas' crisis of faith was in Matthew 27. Matthew 27. And this is so interesting the way the Holy Spirit guided Matthew to record this, because in Matthew 26, immediately before what we're about to read, we have the story of Peter's denial of Jesus 3 times. And he goes immediately into Matthew 27, which there were no 27 then, but on Matthew 27 it says, early in the morning all the chief priests and the elders of the people came to the decision to put Jesus to death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and return the silver coins, the 30 silver coins, to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. So what's interesting, and what I mean by an interesting juxtaposition of why these two passages are right together, because in Matthew 26, right above that, it says, immediately, verse 74, end of 74, immediately a rooster crows, then Peter remembered the word of Jesus had spoken. To me, that correlates with Judas saying he was seized with remorse. Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, that you're going to deny me 3 times. He was, and let me add this, and don't, but I think at that moment he was seized with remorse. Peter was. And in Matthew 27, Judas realizes what he's done and he's seized with remorse. So we've defined crisis of faith as a decision point. When your faith, when this crisis hits you, what are you going to do? Peter is seized with remorse, and it says he went outside and wept bitterly. And then we read in John, I think 21, where he comes back, Jesus welcomes him back and goes through that whole process. But what does Judas do? And this is why it's kind of interesting to end on this one, because most of the crises of faith that we've talked about, people have made the right choice. People have solved their crisis of faith in a positive way. But Judas doesn't. Judas goes out and takes his own life. And what's interesting, the lesson to me for that is, why did he do that? Why did Jesus do that? Would Jesus have welcomed him back? I mean, the only difference between what Peter did and what Judas did is just a little bit of degree, right? Peter denied him. Peter betrayed him. Peter said, I don't even know the guy. Just a difference in degree, really. And Jesus welcomed Peter back. Now, there's some interesting things in the scripture. It says something would be better for that guy if he had never been born. There's a whole lot more that we could get to, especially on the why part that I wanted to get to. But anyway, but our point is crisis of faith. And Judas failed. Why? Why? And have you ever gotten to a point where, and he says, Judas says, I have sinned. I have sinned. And I think the lesson is, if we get to the point, and when we get to the point where we look at Jesus and we say, I have sinned, I have betrayed you, realize He will take you back. Every time. Every time. And to come to that decision point and say, I'm going to go back. Just like the guy in the prodigal, just like the prodigal son. I'm going to go back.
After that event, it would never have been accepted by anybody inside society that talk Jews or those that were normal everything. He would always be the one that had betrayed his friend and caused him to crucify him. No one would have ever accepted it. I mean, that's nature. I mean, that's what it would have been.
That's the reason why he did what he did, right? That's what you're saying. he didn't think there was any way to come back.
Yeah, he may have been looking at that rather than anything else. His, whenever he had sold out the Savior, and the Savior was going to die, what he had done.
Yeah, yeah. Hopeless. He felt hopeless. Yeah. Interesting. Thank y'all.